One. All right.
Welcome everybody to the third session of the project planning series of webinars. This is the third installment and the last of our resource support webinars. So the next three sessions that will be happening in this space, in this subject, will be focused wholly and solely on the assessment tasks. In fact, there are 3 assessment tasks in this subject. We'll have a webinar for each individual assessment task. For this particular installment, the third of our resource support webinars, we're going to be taking you through 2 of the learning activities that you see on Alyssa's screen in front of you right now. And in fact, they're the last 2, I believe. Is that correct?
Yep, absolutely. They're the last.
And budgeting.
Yeah, the last 2, the last
right.
learning activities, which is good.
Sounds great. So what we're going to basically do today, and the point of today, is to take you through each of those 2 learning activities, project risk and budgeting, as well as project success and lessons. We'll actually just get a bit of a chance to explore the material a little bit, unpack it a little bit, just discuss what we know of the material, try and give you some real life examples. If at any stage those that are actually in the actual room live right now, some may be watching it on replay, on a delayed telecast. However, if you are live in the room and you do wish to join in the conversation, we would absolutely love you to be a part of the conversation. What we'll do is just ask that you maybe pop something in the chat window. If you've got a question, just let us know you've got something to contribute to the conversation. We'd love to hear from you. At that point, Alyssa will unmute your microphone as the organiser of this webinar series. So just let us know if you'd like to contribute and we'll get you involved in the conversation. We've had some great input so far from students in conversations, so we do encourage you to join in. So really, we'll be looking at the actual questions in each of those learning activities today, giving you an idea of what we're looking for as answers, talking about the material a little bit, trying to make it a little bit less theoretical and a little bit more, you know, real-world sort of scenario. This particular subject does lend itself to quite a lot of theoretical components, models, theories, ideas, processes, things like that. So we'll try and just make it a little bit more real-world as we go. Alyssa, is there anything you'd like to contribute to the beginning of this session before we jump into the first round of questions?
No, I think you've done a nice intro this afternoon or this evening, Adam. Yeah, it's just obviously the last 2 learning activities for this one before next week when we start hitting the actual assessments themselves. So again, if there's any questions, as Adam's mentioned, and you've got any comments or something you'd like to share with us, feel free to pop something in the chat box at any stage, and we welcome the feedback or we welcome the questions. Yeah.
Okay. Alyssa, you've got a horrible connection at the moment. Is everybody else getting the sound of aliens when Alyssa talks? You've got an incredibly bad connection wherever you are. Alyssa, are you able to move, change, do something to improve your connection?
Can you hear me, or is it still bad?
If you can, that'd be great. Yeah, that's okay. That seems to be a bit better. I'm not sure. Okay, we'll just get straight into it and see how we go. But for those that are in the room, we especially do encourage you to bring up any examples that you can bring up, especially for this particular subject, because as mentioned, this particular subject does lend itself to being, a little bit on the dry side, or it really is just about processes. It's really talking about risk. We're talking about planning, organisation, scoping, those sorts of things. So wherever possible, if you have something to add or to share, it's really, we'd love to hear from you. So please feel free to join in the conversation. Let's jump on to the first series of questions, the first learning activity, which is project risk and budgeting.
Yep. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Now, can you hear me?
All righty. So let's have a look at the first question. Did you want to read out the very first question?
Yeah, absolutely. Can you hear me, or is my voice still muffled?
Okay.
Adam, you there? Hello? Okay.
Hello, you there?
Yeah, a minute. Can you hear me?
No, it's bad. It's bad.
Adam, can you hear me? I can't hear you.
At the moment, all students, we're actually looking at Alyssa's screen, so I'm going to hope that she's able to hear what I'm talking about so that you can actually navigate as we go through. So without a list of time being, I'm going to continue. The very first question in this series of questions is, give 2 examples of possible risks that you may face when planning a project. For example, a major milestone time frame not being met or budget blowouts. What might you do to mitigate this risk? So project planning is the name of the subject. It's all about being involved in project work. One of the biggest components of planning and project work is risk strategy, risk mitigation, but really just being aware and identifying risks initially. So for this question, what we'd like you to do is come up with a couple of examples of possible risks, as the question states, a couple of examples of possible risks that you may face when you're in that planning phase of a project. So one way that I guess I'd like to explore this a little bit with you guys is just a conversation about how many different ranges and types of risks there are. Typically when we talk about risks, we have a tendency to refer to safety issues, the safety risks. So a risk to, a risk of injury, a risk of death, a risk of something serious happening physically to somebody, but risk actually covers absolutely everything. There are many different types of risks, and really for this, we would love it if you would identify a couple of risks that are outside of the health and safety risks that we typically associate when we talk about risks. So I'm going to actually give you a couple of different examples of risks, and just to get a bit of a feeling or a flavour for what we're talking about here. So some different types of risks that you may wish to consider when answering this question include things like commercial risk. So what is a commercial risk? Well, it's a risk that's associated with the business's market placement, business growth, the commercial success of a business. So that's what we call a commercial risk. It's something that might be a risk to the business on a commercial level. Other types of risks, we can include things like compliance or legal risks. So there could be a risk that's, there's a requirement of a particular legislation that we need to adhere to, and there might be a risk involved in the project that we may be in breach of a particular code of practice or some sort of regulation. So these are risks that we may want to consider as well. Other risk types might include things like financial. They're sort of probably the obvious ones we talk about, budget blowouts, things like that. But other financial risks might include things like tax obligations, credit and debtor management, because the people that we may owe money to may have different terms. So we might have to consider things like cash flow. So cash flow becomes a serious risk in project planning, because at different stages of any given project, we may need a certain amount of funds, a certain amount of money to be able to fund the next stage of the project. So a genuine risk is cash flow. That's a genuine risk to a particular project. Health and safety, as we've sort of talked about, or safety risks, they are sort of one and the same. They're the ones that we generally typically go to. Continuing on, we've also got things like environmental risks. Now that could be damage, accidents, natural disasters. It could also be, we might have a lot of pollution or garbage in our project, and where are we going to put that? So there's an environmental hazard or risk as well that we need to consider. There might also be things like strategic risks. Now, if anybody identifies a strategic risk, you're going to get lots of bonus points from the listener line. Now, strategic risks might include, the sustained growth of a business, so something that might impact the overall strategy of a particular business. So you might have this great idea for this new project. It might be a new product line that you want to bring out. But if it is in contrast with your core business, if it aims to grow or sustain the potential growth of your business, then it's a legitimate risk as well. So consider things like that. We might have security risks. So, the security of a premise, the assets. Is there a security threat to the business, to people, or assets of the business? So consider things like security risks. Risks to equipment, so damage to equipment, machinery getting damaged, things like that. That's just to give you a couple of different categories to think about. So really, when we talk about risk, we're talking about anything that has the ability to impact on the outcomes of a given project.
Yep.
So I'll say that again. Anything that has the ability to impact on the outcomes of success of a given project is what we consider a risk. Excuse me. Does that sort of make sense? Alyssa, you're back with us.
Can you see my screen, Adam?
Yeah, you're coming through loud and clear to me now. It's perfect. Thank you.
Yay! I just came in loud and clear just to, just at the tail end of the whole risk question.
Sounds good. Sounds good. So maybe what we should have done is to test our audio before we started.
I don't know, my audio was working fine beforehand, but it's just a bit weird. I guess obviously the follow-up and to everybody out there in the audience as well, I think there are some awesome risks that have been identified by Adam. I suppose you obviously just have to give 2 examples of possible risks you might face and what might you do to mitigate these risks as well. So I guess what are you putting in place to make sure that you're kind of preventing these risks from happening as well? So you really only need to, I guess, identify 2 examples and, yeah, just make sure you kind of ask yourself what might you do to mitigate this risk too.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
It sort of follows on question 2 as well. I think we might just jump straight into question 2 because there's a logical flow on effect here.
Let's do it.
So question 2 talks about what contingency plans have worked for you during projects that you've been involved in. So one of the biggest parts of identifying or risk management, one of the stages is identifying the risk, which is what we were talking about earlier, and then the next part is to put some controls in place to what we call mitigating that risk.
Yeah.
Now, did you want to say something, Lisa?
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, just I'm sure I'm going to I'm sure I've got to have a little bit of a tail end. So you just finish what you have to say before I start, because I might be preempting you, Adam.
Sounds good. Okay, that's okay. Look, I mean, I guess the question is why have a backup plan in process? Why would we bother having contingency plans? Why would you have a contingency plan in place in general?
Absolutely, and I guess you always have to plan for the unexpected. The things that you think will never happen, there is a potential there for them to happen. So having contingency plans are really just protecting you even more from possible risks that could happen. So I guess the whole kind of concept of having a contingency plan is just having the plan and the action there in the event that it does happen. There's probably a high likelihood that perhaps you've identified risks that may not occur, but you've still got some kind of contingency plans in place, especially when it comes to a project. You've just got something there just in case, I like to say. So it's important to have these when you're working on projects, because I guess projects are time-based. There's lots of KPIs associated with projects. There's lots of outcomes associated with projects. And over-planning and having contingency plans that you may not actually use is better than having last minute and having to be quite reactive if something does arise.
Okay. I think we might go through a couple of examples. I've got a few examples here of some risks, and I just think it might be good if we can just, maybe it's just between you and me or the guys in the room today, just to come up with a couple of ideas or some contingencies or what ways that we can mitigate or minimize the potential that risk has to derail us from our success. So I'm just going to start with a really basic one. So, okay, first example of a risk might be that dangerous or hazardous chemicals are used on the site, the project site, and the risk there is that it has potential to cause serious harm and injury. So dangerous or hazardous chemicals used on site, there's a potential to cause serious harm or injury. As I mentioned to you before, there's a whole range of different risks. We'll go through a couple of them with you now anyways. This is obviously the safety or the health risk, but it's a good starting point because it's the one that we most generally associate with. So anybody who's in the room today who wants to contribute, what are some contingency plans or what can we do? So we know that we've got chemicals that are dangerous. We know they're going to be on site. We know they've got the potential to really do some damage, hurt, harm, injure, potentially cause death. So what sort of things can we do? We call them controls. What control measures can we put in place so that we're keeping this in check?
Yep.
Does anybody want to throw a couple of ideas? Time. Okay, can you explain that a little bit more? So for those that are watching on replay, you won't be able to see the chat window that's coming through. We have the first student that's measured, that's typed in the word time as their answer here. Can you provide any more information on that one, time? So what do you mean by time? How is that going to minimise the effect of having hazardous materials? Okay, well that's really clever. Yeah, absolutely. I know exactly where you come here. So the student, for those that are watching on delay, the student here has mentioned that extra time allow extra time just in case something happens. And from what I hear that, you know, if you have a particular project and you're dealing with, you know, chemicals like you're dealing with, instead of rushing somebody to get it done in the next hour, and they're dealing with chemicals that are potentially, you know, very harmful, you know, allow enough time so that that person doesn't feel pressured and doesn't, you know, minimise the chances of them tripping over or spilling over because they're in a rush. Great thinking, excellent.
Yeah.
Once you start thinking, that's the thing about these risks. Once you start thinking about it, it is endless, 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 endless.
And can I add something to that comment as well? Like, you know, if you perhaps had this particular risk, which was dangerous or hazardous chemicals on site, and as mentioned, you know, time and allowing extra time is a great example of perhaps if you were training somebody on how to handle these chemicals, you would train them in terms of time and process and how long it should take you to, I guess, use the chemicals and all those types of associated things. So it could almost be connected to processes as well and training processes.
Yep. Yep. We have another student's got an idea for one in this one. Are you able to type your response in there into the box, Stephen? You've got a contingency plan for this particular hazard? Okay. While we're waiting for a response there, let's talk about another one. I've got another example here. Let's think about some potential contingency plan. So risk here, computer systems breakdown, losing all information about the project, progress, and tasks. So here's a risk that I've identified. What happens if all the computer systems break down and we lose all of the information that we have on our project's progress and tasks? So Alyssa, have you got any ideas on what you might do to mitigate this particular risk?
Oh, I would probably, if this was definitely a risk, I probably would, and we were working significantly with computer systems in order to proceed with the project.
Okay. Alyssa, can you please just mute yourself on my screen?
Hold on a second. Somebody's... Okay, I've got everybody on mute now, so I think we just had an accidental...
All good. That's all right. No dramas.
Yeah. So look, what I would probably do with something like that is if I was quite dependent on computer systems and there was a risk there associated with systems breakdown, I would probably implement a daily process or a daily procedure that saw me back up any system information on a regular basis.
Got it.
Sorry? Yeah, I would also...
I'm saying absolutely perfect. Yeah. You've got it.
I would also probably look at producing regular data reports as well, just in case there was a big chance or a big risk of actual breakdown. And I would probably do that on a daily basis, and I would probably allocate a specific person to take care of that type of
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep, you've basically got the right idea. Let's move on to another one. So this is the process that we want you guys to start thinking about. Yeah. Make no mistake, that is a particular risk that should be in every single risk management of any project, because I could not imagine a project that doesn't use, and if there are projects that are not using any computers, that I'm sure that they could be doing things a little bit better as far as their tools and things like that. Okay, so let's have a look at. Okay, so what about the financial risk? So running out of liquidity. Financial risk. Here's the risk: running out of liquidity. Just to clear that up, liquidity is available funds. So running out of available money to be able to be used. So the business might have a certain amount of wealth. They might be worth $5 million of property and equipment and so forth, but they may have $0 in the bank. That's what we talk about when we talk about liquidity, available funds, money that's able to be used instantly. So it's a legitimate threat or a legitimate risk to a business is lack of liquidity or cash flow. So this is a financial risk. Now, how might you circumvent that? Does anybody have any ideas of how to circumvent the financial risk? Okay, so for this one, I would suggest things like having a line of credit organised or having an overdraft facility organised beforehand, potentially having additional sponsors on standby, or having negotiated a additional line of credit with the project sponsor. So, you know, basic sort of ideas really, basic sort of mitigation ideas, but, you know, imagine you run out of cash. Everything falls to pieces. Everything falls to pieces. You have no cash, you can't fund the next subcontractor, the next batch of materials required, everything stops and everything runs to a stand, you know, stops at a standstill. So let's maybe go with one or two more. Here's a really interesting one. Let's talk about a legal risk. Okay, so I've got one here. Company gets sued, or company is sued, for breaches of privacy laws.
Oh,
Here's a risk. Company getting sued for breaches of privacy laws. Privacy Act. Okay. I'd love to see if anybody's got any thoughts on how they could circumvent. What control measures might they put in place here? So here's a risk. It's a legal risk. We are in breach of, you know,
a subsection of the Privacy Act. Ooh.
Yeah. So what are you going to do to make sure that you control that risk? Some risks you can eliminate, and some risks you have to just measure and monitor and control. These ones are almost, you know, these ones are more that you'll really just want to set up, you know, things in place to control them.
Yeah.
So does anybody have any good ideas out there? This one's not an easy one because there's so many different angles to the actual, you know, the legislation in itself. So what I would say in reference to this one, only allow certain members of your team access to data that is affected under this particular legislation. So for people that don't know, privacy law is just, the Privacy Act is just a series of requirements that companies must use when they're handling people's private information. It's just in reference to how they're allowed to or not allowed to distribute that information, what they must do with that particular information and what they can't do. So you're not just allowed to freely share that with other companies. So there are lots of laws in place for the protection of us as individuals. When we sign up with a particular company, they are not allowed to just freely and deal out our details to other people. So there are laws that protect us. They're called the Privacy Act, or laws under the Privacy Act. So one of the ways is restricting access to certain people. Another way you can circumvent this or control this is to put in place some sort of training or some measurements where you're able to update people on the issues of compliance relating to this particular legislation. So that would be another measure you could put in place. You could also post company policy, make it visible. Quite often company policy is hidden away in a little drawer somewhere, nobody knows. Quite often what businesses are doing these days, they engage in what they call an intranet, which is like an internal internet system. Effectively they can post things like their company policies, procedures, which are effectively readily available for anyone who needs them at any given time in the business. Have you got any other thoughts on this one, Alyssa? Legal risk?
I think this is a bit of a difficult one, but I think you know, it's quite a hard one. It's very hard to control a breach of a piece of legislation because quite often a company can put into place great training, incorporated codes of conduct, incorporate these types of things into contracts or agreements with employees or agreements with suppliers as well. And quite often, sometimes it's just one individual that might be responsible for the breach. So it is quite a hard type of risk to find a control measure for. I think it really is a matter of just making sure that, as Adam's mentioned, you've got a really tight policy structure. You've done some really strong training with those people that have access to private and confidential information. It is incorporated into your processes somehow, whether it be a contract, whether it be a code of conduct, and your employees really understand their responsibility in terms of this piece of legislation. So it can be quite a hard one for companies. It can be quite because you can do everything you can try and do, but there can be individuals that sometimes breach those. But as long as you've protected yourself and the company, then yeah.
One of the main ways that companies do this is they have employment contracts, and they say, here's the deal. Basically, you want to come away for us? Here is the go. If you do this, if you do that, if you do the other, that this is all on you now.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And
they cover themselves from a legal standpoint.
Yeah.
Let's move on to the next one because I just had a look at the time and wow, we are moving through at a fast rate here.
I just lost my
Let's talk about risk management because the next question talks about risk management. So risk management is really the process of managing these risks. So what is the actual process of managing the risk? I'm actually going to give you the steps now. I'm going to ask if you can actually list them on the screen, and we'll just briefly talk about what each of these steps are. I'd really like for you to identify these steps. It's really just the process, I guess, thereof. So first step is defining the risk or risk identification. I'm happy for that to be one and the same. So defining the risk or identification of the risk. So effectively, first things first, you've got to work out what is the risk. Describe the risk. When describing the risk, describe what can happen. What's the scope of the risk? When I say define the risk, define how far it relates to. Is the risk only a risk for a given particular work site? Is the risk a risk for a particular branch of the company? Is it a risk for only one person on the project team? Is it a risk for a particular department or all departments? So risk identification / risk definition, define what is it and how far and wide does it go. So the next stage, is risk assessment. So with risk assessment, we typically use something called a risk matrix. Sorry, that came out a bit wrong, didn't it? Melissa, do you have, excuse me, do you have that risk assessment matrix that I sent you through the other day, the one that had the likelihood, this, that, and the other? So when we talk about risk assessment, I'm happy to just continue chatting if you can find that. When we talk about risk assessment, we generally talk about two things. We look at effectively two things about the risk to assess that risk. The first thing that we look at is the likelihood of that risk occurring. So if one of our risks was that we're all going to get abducted by aliens, maybe we think this is a legitimate risk. Cool, we've put it on our plan. We think that we're going to get abducted by aliens. I would suggest that when we're assessing this risk, that it's a very low probability of it happening. So likelihood is the word that is commonly used. That's the sort of lingo that gets used. So what is the likelihood? So this stage 3, Alyssa, is what we call risk assessment. Sorry, stage 2 is risk assessment using the risk matrix. So 1, what is the likelihood of it occurring? Is it a high likelihood, a medium likelihood, or a low likelihood?
Is this sorry to disturb you, Adam, is this the one that you're talking about?
This is risk assessment. This is assessing the actual risk. Oh, sorry, I'm looking at the screen now. Yeah, that's exactly it.
All right,
so you'll see on the left-hand side, that's as I said, there's two components to risk assessment. One is likelihood. How likely is it? So is it a certain, a likely, a possible, unlikely, rare? I would say being abducted by aliens is quite rare. I would say other risks that you might include, which might be electricity blacking out, things like that, are possible or likely, so higher likelihood of that happening. The second, as you can see on the screen, is the impact. So if that does happen, what's the impact? Is it catastrophic? Is that the end of all ends? Or is it really insignificant? So you have to look at each given risk that you've got and work out what the impact of it is. This is really a way of just trying to determine with each of the risks that you've got which ones are really got to be kept under watch and key, and which ones can you just sort of monitor as you go a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Things that are catastrophic, that are very high likelihood, they become extreme. You see how that works on that matrix that you've got on the screen? And they're the ones that you really want to keep a bit of an eye on. Let's just go back to completing the cycle, the risk management cycle.
Yep.
So the next stage, we talk about risk strategies. So really at this point it's a matter of just starting to control the risk. So start to put in place measures so that contingency planning, minimizing it. You always try and eliminate a risk if you can. So if you can get rid of it, do. So at this point it's risk strategy or controlling the risk is the next stage. And the last stage is really monitoring it and reviewing it. It's really important that once you've dealt with something that you keep an eye on it. If you discover there's a bit of water on the floor somewhere and you go, cool, I'm just going to stick a sign up and a towel down and that's sorted. And what happens if you don't monitor it? Well, you may not be aware that there's a little leak coming from the roof somewhere. And in fact, by not looking at it and thinking that you've just solved this problem, that actual risk will continue to become a risk because you haven't monitored it. It's important that with all risks that you monitor them, make sure that they're still there. Are they a threat? Has the threat changed? Is the likelihood increasing, decreasing? Is the impact likely to be more severe or less severe? So that's effectively and look, there are many versions thereof of a risk management process effectively. This is trying to make it as small as possible. Everybody's got their own different way on it. We don't mind which way you use. This is the one I'm giving you today. You'll see there's different ones in the material. You'll see there's plenty of different ones online. I'm more than happy if you just give us the components that you would expect to see in a risk management strategy, a plan which will include strategies for minimizing, identifying and drawing up the scope, assessing the likelihood and the impact of the risk, and monitoring the risk by who, by when. If you give us basically those sort of broad ideas in your answer, then you'll cover it beautifully. Alyssa, I think we have to progress
a
little bit faster. I'm so sorry.
It's all good. Let's go on to the last two questions.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's jump on to the next couple of questions. I think this next one will be pretty quick and easy. A SWOT analysis.
Yep.
SWOT is SWOT. It just stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So the question here is consider a project that you need to implement and develop a brief SWOT strength. Okay, if you don't have a project in mind, come up with one. Just make one up. It doesn't really matter what it is. We're happy if you come up with anything. You can use an example of you've been commissioned to paint the Parliament House building. You've been commissioned to put up all the Christmas decorations in the city of Melbourne. Whatever that particular project is, just identify some strengths and weaknesses, or talk about a project that you could do around the house. Talk about a project you're involved in, or just talk about any project. It doesn't matter. We're happy to use any. And just identify some of the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that exist for each. Really, a SWOT analysis is just an evaluation tool. So don't be confused or uncomfortable with this. It's just a method of evaluating anything. So
how many? I guess what's your take on how many strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats? I'm probably looking at about 2 of each. I think that would be like 2 to 3 of each of the different areas of a SWOT.
Yeah, look, I'm happy if you answer each of it, if you demonstrate knowledge on each. So if you're not sure, you've given us a good enough answer, give us another one. We'd rather you put a bit more than a bit less if you're not sure. As long as you clearly demonstrate the difference between strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, we're happy. Firstly, strengths and weaknesses are what we call internal things. So that's what we're looking at as internal strengths of the businesses. What do we do well? What does the business do well? What resources does the business have? Weaknesses, what don't we do well? What are competitors doing better than us? Actually, so that's more of a threat, I should say, because the opportunities and threats are external. So things are outside of the business. Opportunities, what are there? What are opportunities in this particular project that are outside of the business? What are the threats that are outside of the business that we have no control on? So threats are effectively external, they're negative factors. What are the things that we have no control on? So a threat might be that your competitor Yeah, it could be legislation. Yeah, we have absolutely legislation is a threat potentially. The government changes the budget changes. Wow, that completely changes. A lot of companies are relying on budgets. So if that's really all we want you to do, come up with any given project, just list 2 or 3 examples of strengths, weaknesses. Remember, they're internal measurements, opportunities and threats. They're the external ones, and it's just it's a method of evaluating. It's an evaluation tool.
Yeah, absolutely. All right.
Yeah.
Shall we move on to question number 5?
Indeedly.
All right, lovely. So there's the very last question in that learning activity is, why do you think transparent communication is important in relation to the project budget and cost factors? I guess the key term there, or the key couple of terms, is transparent communication. So I guess, does anybody want to guess what transparent communication is? If we say a company or a manager's transparent, what do we mean by that? What do we mean by transparent? I love that word.
Question.
I love it.
It's a good word, isn't it? I haven't actually thought about it, but that's a good word.
Yeah, I use that word quite a lot in as just a kind of like almost like an interpersonal skill, transparency sometimes. So don't hide. Absolutely, yeah. So see, that's a really nice word. That's a really nice description there, and it's a real, like, I think when you are looking at a project, especially when it comes to project budget and cost associated and factors around there, I think it's really important to be honest and open and genuine with the information that you're communicating to your team members. Don't try and hide information from them. Share as much information as you can about the project success, especially when it comes to money. If there's an issue with budget restraints, or if you feel like the project is exploding in terms of costs, be open with your team members about that. They need to know, because quite often they are the people that perhaps might be spending, or they might be making decisions that perhaps are affecting budget. So you need to be able to tell them, and you need to be honest and open with your communication so they know exactly where they stand and what restrictions and boundaries they have.
But this question is purely talking about in relation to the project budget and cost. So we're talking about cash. We're talking about money spent on this project. Why is it important to be really open and visible with your communication? Don't hide. As one of our students has mentioned, don't hide. Why is that all important when we're talking about money and cost? And, you know, I mean, I like to consider there's always unknown factors. You know, there's issues that we identified earlier, like cash flow issues, that if you're not open and transparent with your communication about where money's going and where to spend it and things like that, you may be completely unaware of a business expense that's due to pop up at a certain time and totally cripple the business from its cash flows.
Yep.
So, you know, unknown, you know, it's what we don't know that can really hurt us. There might be unexpected. People might be aware of other things. There might be some member that you're sharing with one of your stakeholders that knows of a better or a cheaper way to do it. Hey, we don't have to spend the money buying a whole new machine. We've already got the facility and capability to do it with the old machine. So, you know, sometimes engaging with, you know, subject matter experts or certain stakeholders in relation to cost and expenditure is really important, because they might know of some better ways or some alternatives.
Okay.
We're happy if you can provide an answer here that seems to answer that pretty well, then we're pretty happy. I think that's it. Does anybody have any questions in relation to risk management, either the SWOT analysis or any of the questions that have been up here so far? If you have any questions you would like to ask, just pop something in the chat window and we'll unmute your microphone. You can join in the conversation. Okay, so what we'll do in that case is we'll jump on to the next series of questions.
Yep, I'm just loading those next questions up, so just give me a uno momento.
Sure, I sure can do.
Thank you very much.
I'm not sure how to say that I'm not sure how to say that in Portuguese, but there you go. Okay, so The next series of, the next learning activity that we're going to look at now is what we call project success and lessons. So it's actually the very last of the learning activities and project planning.
Yep.
For those that don't know, you do need to push through all of these learning activities before the assessments are available and open up. Our suggestion always is get through them as quickly as you can. You'll be getting feedback from Alyssa and myself within 24 hours. And then you'll be ready to go. So let's have a look at the first question. While it's loading up, I'll just read it out because I've actually got it here. First question is list examples of typical KPIs or metrics that your organisation uses to measure project success. So a KPI, what is a KPI? A KPI stands for a key performance indicator, and it is just exactly as it says.
Yeah.
It's a performance indicator. It's an indicator of performance.
Yeah.
Now in sport, an indicator of a KPI in sport, if I was a cricketer, a KPI might be batting average. What is my average score as a batter? That might be an indicator of my performance, my batting average. If I'm a footy player, it might be how many kicks, marks, goals, tackles per game I'm achieving. That might be one of my KPIs as a professional footballer to achieve 456 tackles per. That's a pretty fair effort.
I don't know. I'm just like, I don't know how many tackles. It's kind of.
Gee, it's pretty brutal, the game you're playing. Okay, so if it's the stock exchange, your stock exchange, what might be your metrics if you're a financial, investor? Your metrics might be dividends, rate of returns, average payback periods on investments. These are the types of metrics that you might be used there. In manufacturing, if you're making things, if you're manufacturing items, what are some of the KPIs that you might have in manufacturing? Well, you might use things like cycle time. We call that also flow rate, I think. How long does it take for the first input to make it to the end of the manufacturing chain? Those types of things. So that's all we're talking about when we talk about KPIs, ways to, to measure the success or indicators of success, really, is what it's about. What are some typical... Okay, so this question says, list some examples that your organisation might use to measure project success. If you can use things from your own organisation, wonderful. However, if you don't have an example that you can use previously from work or in some sort of work scenario, we are more than happy for you just to give us some basic, broad project management KPI examples. So, project management, basic, broad project management examples. Yep. Okay, so basic broad project management. Let's give a couple of examples. Do you want to jump into the deep end and give me an example of a project management KPI?
I would say two project management KPIs might be around time and might be around expenditure. They're very broad, but I would probably say that one of the biggest KPIs probably around a project would definitely be maybe a time-based KPI. So
absolutely. It's probably the biggest threat. It's probably the biggest performance indicator for projects is completion time.
Yeah.
Because you might do the project, we got there, the whole project was a success. When was the project meant to have been completed by? 10 years ago? Yeah. Really? Okay. Yeah. So, that's when you consider it like that, the actual time of completion is probably one of the most fundamental parts of it. Yep. Yeah, so obviously the cost, how much money was spent, that's certainly a measurement. You might get the project done for 6 times the amount that you initially budgeted for. Well, it's not that clever, really, if you blow out of budget by that much. You can really achieve anything with unlimited amounts of money. So that's not really, so that's why we might use budgets or costs as a method. Labour costs, absolutely. That might be an absolute indicator of your performance. How much dough are we spending on labour? Mm-hmm. Is it out? Is it in? Other things that you might consider might be quality of the items produced or the service produced. So there might be, indicators in relation to quality of what you're producing. Yep. It also might be things like, whether probably the thing that we should talk about most obviously here is a link to the project outcomes. So what were, the project outcomes? Were the project outcomes achieved? What were the deliverables? What were the project outcomes? Were they achieved? and that's really what we should set as a performance indicator.
Mm.
It also might be things like feedback from our customers. Are they satisfied?
Yep.
Are our customers happy? That might be an indicator for us in terms of how it goes. So, okay, so
Yep.
let's move on to the next question, shall we? Okay, so it looks like there's a question coming from me. It's actually one of my students who I've provided my login to today's session.
Right.
We're simply talking about project management in general terms there, Mitch. Thanks, Mitch. So, Mitch, in general terms, this subject's all about project management. It's about working on projects. More than happy for you just to use the example of just project management as a general term. If you've had experience with working with projects before, so talk about, you can use, actually this question here, it says, think of a project recently you've implemented, make a list of deliverables. Well, if you haven't been in a project recently, you can't use an example, more than happy for you to come up with any example of a project and just make a list of deliverables in terms of what we're trying to achieve. Are you happy with that, Alyssa? As an
Yeah,
answer?
absolutely. It's just funny that I can see you answering, like you asking questions. It's funny.
No, I realised that I actually gave a link. Mitchell was trying to get a link into the site, and I've given him my registered link, so that's why it comes up with his name already there, or my name as him. But anyway, that's okay. We'll be okay. There's two of me. Could you believe that?
I know.
Anyways, let's have a. Can you talk a little bit about a deliverable? There might be a little bit of confusion on what a deliverable means. I might get you just to figure that one up.
Okay. Look, I reckon the best way to kind of I guess explain what a deliverable is. I think the deliverable is the end result of a project outcome, essentially. So what I think is that you've kind of set your project objectives, and your deliverable comes as is a tangible piece of evidence to support the fact that you've achieved your outcome. So does that make sense? So it could be. It could be, say, for example, you've changed over a system or something, or you've implemented a system. So your objective was to change and implement a system, and the deliverable is the actual server upgrade working effectively. And producing reports that you need it to produce. So essentially I think of a deliverable as more of a tangible result or a tangible indication that shows you've achieved your outcome.
You've actually absolutely nailed it there with your explanation. The word tangible is exactly what it's about. And like how we talk about in goal setting, the idea of deliverable needs to be extremely specific, it needs to be measurable, and when we say tangible, it needs to be tangible. Yeah. So yeah, if your goal of the project outcomes is to implement a brand new telephony solution for a call center, one of your deliverables might be training all members of the team up on the new system. One of the deliverables must be that you must be able to pick the phone up and call other people. Yep. It's an obvious one, but it's one of the deliverables. If you cannot pick the phone up and call other people, well, then these new phones ain't working.
Yep, that's
so.
Yeah.
It's the stuff you can touch and hold. Be really clear about it. So just come up with any given project. It can even be a project around the house. We don't even mind if you use an example. So just list and give an example, or refer to the example that you're talking about, and then just give us a couple of the different deliverables, the tangible things in there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, you might need to mute Mitch's mic there, Alyssa.
Okay, hold on a second.
Yeah, the dog's not in the office. That's not coming from me.
Oh.
Wrong one. There we go. Cool.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so let's move on to the next question. So now, I think one of the students mentioned that they don't want to be seeing question 4. We're only up to question 3, but when we get to question 4, we will give you a heads up.
All right, okay, I'm just popping on to question 3.
Yeah. By the way, you're okay, Mitch. You're all right, matey. By the way, if anybody has any questions, just throw something in the box, and we shall unmute your microphone so you can chat. Describe 3 ways. Yeah.
Yeah.
describe 3 ways you could evaluate the success of a project. So this is a really broad sort of question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um,
How do you?
again,
I
this
mean,
is
I guess.
very much linked.
Yeah.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I guess this is kind of a little bit about 3 actual ways that you know whether or not your project's really been a success, and any kind of, I guess, tangible documentation or any kind of reports or results that might indicate that your project was successful. I mean, how do you know that you've succeeded when you've done a project? You need something. You need results, or you need things that show you that you have been at the that your project has actually been a success. So what are 3 ways that you could work out whether or not your project has been a success? Okay. I mean, I guess there are lots of different ways, and I'm quite open to responses here because it will depend on the project that you're kind of making reference to as well.
Okay, let's make this a real life example because I think we haven't done that so well today. So let's use the example of a project of Alyssa. You have been commissioned as the project lead, the project manager. You've been commissioned to paint Parliament House. You have
Oh
that?
my goodness.
You are in charge of a repaint, a refurb of Parliament House in Canberra.
Hope they're paying me some nice money for that.
Some good coin, yeah. Now, how are you going to evaluate the success? Now, anybody who's in the chat window, you feel free to throw some ideas here. What are some ways that Alyssa, as the project manager, who's been commissioned by the government to paint Parliament House, how could she evaluate if her project's been a success or not? How will she know if it's been successful? So what are some ways that Alyssa, as a project manager, could evaluate the success of this given project?
Yeah.
So I'll throw it out to anybody who wants to throw some ideas out.
Yep.
Now I'll give you a couple of categories or some hints. The ways that you can evaluate or some categories that you can use.
All right, Stephen's popped in the chat box, ask cabinet. So,
okay.
Yeah, so absolutely. Okay, yep, great. Oh, we've got a few coming through, Adam.
Yeah, good.
Yeah. So there are definitely some ways. I mean, asking cabinet could almost be kind of gathering feedback as well. So feedback will be indicative of how successful, feedback from your stakeholders will be indicative of how successful your project is. I think there was also...
Imagine that the people that are sitting in Parliament House, these are the guys that I'm guessing Stephen's referring to here when you're talking about asking the cabinet. Really, I'm looking at that as a engage and speak and get feedback off of your key stakeholders. The people that are going to be sitting in Parliament House are the ones that also have a big stake in this as well. So how are we going to know if we did a successful job? Well, we should probably talk to the guys that are going to be sitting there and say, hey, how do you feel about the paint job? And they might say, you know what, I don't really like spotted pink. It's not my favourite colour. But no, anyway, I'm just joking about that. Yeah, that's that's the one that potentially might be one way of evaluating the success of our project. Asking our stakeholders, asking the people that are using it, how is it? Now, a couple of students have identified some other ways as well. Yeah, stay within budget. Have we gone over? That's a way we can measure the success as well. Did we keep everything under budget? Yep. Absolutely. Did we finish on time as well? That's absolutely another one too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. I mean, like, they're all really good almost KPI indicators, and they're almost project outcomes, and you're kind of measuring your success against your initial KPIs and your project outcomes, which is really good. So I think it's a really good thought process everybody's having.
Now, some are really hard. Some projects are really hard to determine the success of because they're just process changes, and it's just hard to determine. So quite often, project managers will determine the success of a project based on, this is an interesting one, but based on how many outstanding issues are on that particular project. So you generally, with every project, you've got an issues log or some sort of defects log, depending on what, if it's a piece of software that's being implemented, you often have what we call a defect log. Depends on what it is, but depending on how many defects or outstanding issues there are at project closure is a determining measure of success.
Yep.
For some project managers, So there you go.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep, an online poll. So yeah, really engaging with your stakeholders is a good way to evaluate it. So let's have a look at the next one.
Absolutely. Okay.
So why is it important to involve team members in the review of a project?
Yep.
So yeah, look, we've sort of covered this in many ways in terms of why is it important. I think we had the question last week of why is it important to engage in key stakeholders when planning. And it's a similar sort of philosophy here. You know, why do you involve team members in the review of a project?
Yeah. And I guess
The way that I would
they are key. Yeah. They are definitely key players in your project. Your team are the people that work with you to help achieve the outcomes of a project. You know, they're part of the process, they're part of the success of the project, and as we really talked about last week, they are key to driving, they're key to motivating, they're key to focusing, and they're usually the ones that probably do a lot of the hard yards to help get to that end result. So it really is important to really involve them in the process. If they're contributing to the success, they should be involved in the actual review of the project. They should know how it's going, or they should know how it turned out and what the results of it were, because they shared in that process. So yeah.
Absolutely, and usually team members are on the front line of a project, so you know the project manager's aware of what everybody's doing, but they're not in the front line. They're not out there on, you know, dealing with the day-to-days of that particular component of the project. So you need to engage in those members that are on the front line, because they may give you some tips to work with for next time.
Yep.
You know, some ideas on how to minimise issues going forward for next time. All of these things are important. This is partially why you do a review, is to identify some things that you could do better for next time. Or on the flip side, work out, hey, you know what, this was a fantastic idea, it worked beautifully, or this was really good about the project, so keep that in mind for next time.
Yeah.
So you just as likely discuss the successes as well as any issues as well.
Absolutely.
But also you don't want to disenfranchise those that have committed such a lot of time to doing something. You know, you engage people to work for you or to work on a given project. You want them to feel good about themselves, and these are the reasons that we were talking last week about engaging stakeholders. You want people to be a part of something so that they, don't derail your project, but you want people to feel good about their involvement, and you want to motivate people to work hard and continue to work hard, so you always try and include people in all sort of discussions, so that's in the early stage as well as the ending stage.
Yep.
And it gives you a chance also to, you know, enjoy some of the successes of the project, to share some of those moments as a group.
Absolutely.
With the other team members.
Absolutely. And a team success, I mean, there's nothing better than being part of a successful team and celebrating that success, you know?
It's the best part about it. I love project work, and anybody who gets an opportunity to be involved in any sort of project team, take it with open arms. I'm on my third one, or I've done 3. Obviously, you've had a couple as well.
Yeah.
They're dynamic, because, you know, the thing I like about a project is, and this might sound silly, but what I like about a project is it has an end date. Now, work generally doesn't. You know, you're sitting there, you've got the inbox, you've got the outbox. There's work always coming in. It never ends. Yeah. A project does end. There is a logical ending, and it feels good to work on something that has a logical conclusion, because you're working through it, you get to the end, and then you stand back and go, oh, there it is. We got it. We did it.
Yeah.
And, you know, it also feels good as a human to be part of something that's bigger and greater than yourself. So when you're working on something that has meaning, that you feel is of greater, has some sort of significant greater end use value, or something that's greater than just your component of it, it's actually a really important part of human motivation as well. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's nice.
Let's do the last question, and then we'll throw it out to the crew.
Okay, let's have a look at this last question. Oh my goodness, sorry, I'm just all over. There we go. Last question. All right. So that very last question is, regarding a project you have been involved with in the past, describe 3 lessons that you learned, and how would you communicate the lessons in an effective way? I guess all of us are very, very different, and we take different experiences away from different things in our lives. So I guess some of the lessons that I've learned on projects are probably very different to perhaps some of the lessons that other people have learnt. And how I use those lessons obviously is probably up to my own, I guess, style of management and style of interaction too. So I guess what we're looking for here is just really for you to be quite open and maybe just kind of give us a bit of an idea of, again, 3 lessons that you've learned. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a work-based project. It can also be obviously a project that you might be doing at home. But what are 3 lessons that you learn about going through a project process? You know, I've probably learned that for me, some of the lessons I've learned is I've always learned that you need to expect the unexpected. When a project is going through its motions and when you're planning for it, you should always plan for everything, even if you think it is not going to happen, because chances are, you know, the most unbelievable thing that you never expected will actually happen. So the more, I guess, you've got focus on your risk management plans and the more you're focusing on your contingency plans, for me, you know, that's probably one of the biggest lessons I've learned. So in that phase of communicating, risk management is a really big part of my planning. So in the planning process, that's when I communicate the importance of risk management. So I just make sure my scope and my project plan is really, and my risk management plan is really tight, essentially.
The second part of this question was there, it says, how would you communicate the lessons in an effective way? Because what the question is actually asking you, and it rolls over on from the last one, which is talking about reviewing a project. So this is sort of saying, cool, you've learned a few lessons about, you've done the review, you've done the project, finished, you've learned some lessons, how you can actually communicate those in the future. So your example of, you know, consider everything or expect the unexpected, with the terminology I think you use, that's a very difficult one to communicate, that lesson. So how would you potentially go about communicating that?
Yeah, well, I would definitely, I would probably be communicating it probably more in a, in the beginning. So say for example I had experienced that lesson in a previous project, I would then really focus in on communicating that in a very informal process at the beginning of an actual project itself, if that happens. So next time, so I would be communicating, using it as motivating, use it as kind of more of a mentoring or coaching approach, as lessons I've learned and I've experienced. So that's essentially how I would communicate that in future projects.
I always use past data, use hard facts. That always helps to persuade people. So if you're wanting to show a lesson that you've learned from the past, pull up the data, show them. Show, hey guys, this was a recent project we did. This is the money that we invested in this area. This was the result of doing that. This is what we've learned since then. People are much more likely to, you know, agree or be persuaded by your ideas if you've got some facts to back it up. So, you know, if you can pull out some facts, pull out the financials, pull out the data, pull out the hardcore facts that can show, because that's what we're talking about when we're communicating in an effective way, trying to teach people the lessons that we've learned. We're passing those lessons on. We need to sort of try and convince people of what we've learned as the gospel. So use some facts, use some figures. Yeah, the one thing that I would sort of say as, you know, just a generic kind of lesson learned with working is always involve people in your team and never, ever, ever assume anything. I've seen it with projects before where people went, oh, shit, I thought you were at that meeting, or didn't you know about the changes here. Even if you think that, even if the person was in the meeting, you cannot presume that they were listening at that particular moment of time. So you have to cover yourself, never presume. So if there is a key change, a process change, an update of anything, use multiple ways to communicate any given anything. So if you communicate something in a meeting, what you should be doing is follow up a meeting with a list of meeting points, so that person goes, oh yeah, okay, so they were all the things, yep, they were all the things discussed. We have to never presume anything is one of the lessons here. So always involve your team, never presume anything, and, you know,
expect the unexpected.
Always, you know, but you use multiple ways of getting a message across, you know, so quite often what happens is when we communicate, we sort of communicate to our understanding, and where there's no consideration for the receiver of their understanding. So try and communicate using multiple different ways of communicating to different strategies, because that'll just cover your bases for you know, for the other person understanding what you're talking about. Did that make sense? I was a bit confused as I was explaining it myself. I think that's pretty much it, yeah.
Yeah.
Does anybody else, or does anybody that's in the live feed today like to share any of their experiences with working on projects, any lessons that they learned, any stories that they want to share with the group in terms of experiences working in the project team? You're welcome to do so now, or any questions about the course, this is your opportunity. Okay, so we think we might end the recording there, and then if any student wishes to, then you can actually take your eyes off mute as well.
Okay.
Okay, thanks very much everybody for your attendance on the third installment of the Project Planning webinar series. See you next week.